We are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now watching this video. The International Labour Office and the Geneva Environment Network have the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for your new Geneva dialogue in the run-up to the Stockholm+50 conference. Our dialogue today focuses on jobs and a just transition for all in a healthy planet and is co-sponsored by Sweden. Today, we are celebrating International Mother Earth Day. It is the occasion to reflect on how humanity has been treating our planet, as the United Nations Secretary General mentioned in his message on today's celebration. We have been poor custodians of our fragile home, does he remind us. Today, the Earth is facing a triple planetary crisis, threatening the well-being and survival of millions of people around the world. Our jobs and businesses depend on a healthy planet and are central to make the transition needed. 50 years ago, the world came together for the Stockholm Conference. It was the start of the global environmental movement. Since then, we have many examples of what is possible when we act as one, but we need to do much more and much faster. In June this year, less than 2 months from now, the world will gather once again in Sweden for the Stockholm+50 international meeting, where our leaders are expected to bring the ambition and action needed to address our triple planetary emergency. In the run-up to this important meeting, our event today will address the global environment agenda and its implications for decent work, the just transition we need to protect the planet, people, and the economy. We have only one Mother Earth. We must do everything we can to protect her. Before we start with the opening remarks for this event, and if Her Excellency has not joined us with setting the scene, let me remind you that throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We will use your questions to feed the discussion. And so proceeding with our agenda, let me just check if Her Excellency is with us. She's not. So I will turn to Mustafa Kamal Goye, who is the Global Coordinator of the Green Jobs Program at the International Labour Organization, who will be setting the scene for this event. And we will proceed with the opening remarks once Her Excellency Ambassador Johanna Lissinger-Paetz is able to connect. Many thanks. Kamal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gianna. And if I may require you, just please call me Mustafa. And I also want to just ask panel members if they agree. We just call ourselves by our first name so that we can have a conversation here. So dear Excellencies, colleagues, and it's a pleasure to have you on this occasion, this important occasion of the celebration of Earth Day towards the Stockholm+50 conference, looking 50 years back at the global environmental agenda and projecting ourselves towards the future, but doing that in a way where we realize that since 1972, the world has changed. It has changed in many ways, in the way economies and societies function, in the way population dynamics is, and in the way the global issues, economics, social development, environment have become interconnected. And we now have a 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which brings all these challenges together. So therefore, the way we look at the environmental agenda is very much different from the way our predecessors and leaders did in 1972. So that is why in this discussion today, we have the privilege to have a panel of very distinguished speakers from a range of organizations that come from different backgrounds and are able to look at these major global environmental challenges from different perspectives, from the business perspective, from world of work and trade unions perspectives, from industry, and from the UN and government perspective. So I have the pleasure to welcome Brenda, who is Program Manager, Circle and Excellence on Plastic Pollution at the UN Environment Program, Helena, who is a Policy Director at the FAIR Initiative, Arab, who is the Executive Director of Seed Entrepreneurship for Sustainable Development, Marsa, who is a Manager at the UN Global Compact, Robert, who is an advisor for climate change and green economy at the International Organization of Employers, and Bert, who is a climate policy officer at the International Trade Union Confederation. So with that, a warm welcome, colleagues and friends, to our conversation today. I just wanted to start by stating that in the moment we are in, we must recognize that the responsibility towards the natural environment goes with the challenges and opportunities to improve human well-being, advance social justice, and promote a decent work for all. I think at this moment, there is a clear understanding that preserving and restoring the natural assets that underpin economic activity and human well-being can go hand in hand with more and better jobs and ensure a just transition for all. So to frame this conversation, we will have a discussion in two parts. In the first, we will take stock of where we are on the global environmental agenda, what are the issues in front of us, and we will turn in the second part of the discussion towards looking at solutions. Looking at the state of play, I want to turn to Brenda first. And so Brenda, why is plastic pollution, which was just one of the major agendas at the last UN Environment Assembly, so critical for environmental sustainability? And what are the links to employment and the world of work?
Thank you very much, Mustafa, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Connecting jobs and the just transition to a healthy planet is a really important topic here on Earth Day, so happy to be part of this. So the UNEA resolution on ending plastic pollution made the news. UNEA, being the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment, adopted this resolution to end plastic pollution in early March. And in it, member states really agreed to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. An overview perspective would be that we have political, industry, community momentum like never before. And it's a really powerful time for us to join hands and work together. Historically, we've seen successes that can inspire us. So for many years at UNEP, I was involved in the negotiation process for the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And I recall convening stakeholders on many occasions to discuss mercury use in artisanal and small-scale gold mining, as you'll recall. And as a complex development issue, it seemed unlikely that this sector could ever be covered under a global legal instrument. While it encompassed 10 to 15% of the global market, for gold, it was also just too complicated. And yet, through collaboration of a multitude of players, today we have provisions in the Minamata Convention for small-scale gold mining. And this aspect of the convention is really viewed as a true success story. So I thought it was important to raise this one quickly on Earth Day, because I think it was really a success story for informal gold miners. And it benefited not only the environment, but also the health of miners and the economies of mining communities. So I think we can take that story as a source of inspiration as we move to plastics. So if you could just put the slide up of the UN campus in Nairobi at UNEP headquarters of the plastics tap, I think it's there. I just would ask in the chat if anyone's familiar with this picture and maybe signal yes or no. Yes, if you are, because I think many of you are. And this giant tap is made out of plastic waste sourced from Kibera, which is described as the largest slum in Africa. So all of what you see in this picture, it's quite a beautiful picture, but all of what you see there is plastic waste. And the installation was created by an international artist and activist named Benjamin Van Wong, and it received a lot of media coverage. But to build this 30-foot installation, Van Wong enlisted the help of the Human Needs Project, which is a local NGO providing services and opportunities to people living in the area. And so the building of this installation itself provided temporary jobs for over 100 residents from the slums, which are located just 10 miles from the United Nations headquarters where the negotiations were taking place. So these plastics were sourced from the informal waste sector. They were sanitized and tied together before they were brought to the UN campus. And I just wanted to show it because I think the giant tap has been a source of inspiration for action. Many photos have been in the international media, so even if you weren't at UNEA, you maybe saw these in the media, and they really were, it was really used as an inspiration to turn off the tap on plastic pollution. So it's a small artistic effort, but it also brought benefit to a local community and connected the world to how important the informal waste sector is. The informal waste sector is dealing with different types of waste, including plastic waste. And in 2016, it's estimated that waste pickers were responsible for collecting up to 65% of the plastics for recycling globally. So this is really significant. And just to give you some insights of the resolution before I dig deeper later on, the resolution requests our executive director to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop a legal instrument on plastic pollution. This group will start their work in the second half of 2022 and complete it by the end of 2024. The ask is really, really ambitious, but it's important because plastics, of course, are linked to climate, nature, and pollution, and they really can provide a benefit to local communities in terms of our work. So today at UNEP, all our hands are on deck in preparing for this process for an open-ended working group, which will take place at the end of May in Dakar. And we really hope to see the informal waste sector in this process and can be inspired by the successes of the development of the Minamata Convention, and we look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Brenda, for framing the issue on plastic. I'd like to turn to Helena with another challenge, which is the sustainability of food systems, which we all depend on. So for FAIR, what are the main challenges with the current food system? Why is it that there are problems?
Thanks. So FAIR is an investor network, and we work with institutional investors on the issues linked to sustainable agriculture. And we actually have investors with over 50 trillion in assets under management in our institution. But actually, we work with the investors around some of the major key issues that we see, such as deforestation, water scarcity, climate change, working conditions, and public health. And we actually have a food system that currently generates around 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, over 80% of antibiotic use, around 1/3 of water use, and is the leading driver of global biodiversity loss. And what's more, it's not delivering for people either. We have over 700 million people regularly going hungry, while in other areas there's overconsumption of unhealthy and unsustainable food associated with serious health problems. So in FAIR's working conditions engagement, we engage with some of the largest meat companies to try and improve their performance against these indicators. And we saw two major trends emerging in the meat sector that present these challenges and also opportunities. One is climate risk, and then also the trend of automation. And if not managed properly, these trends can lead to job losses and displacement of workers. And we see that companies are starting to address these. So some companies are setting net zero targets to reduce their emissions. But we don't yet see the companies taking measures to address how their workers will be affected by those strategies, such as retraining their workers for more sustainable jobs. And so far, we've seen much more focus on the just transition in the energy sector than in the food and agriculture sector. But we really need to talk about the just transition in both of those areas. So in our dialogue with companies, the investors are calling on the companies to align their strategies with a just transition framework to maximize positive outcomes for workers and communities. Another topic I just quickly wanted to touch on, obviously, was food security as well. And as we reflect on the current spike in food prices, we need to look ahead to the increasing pressure from climate change, from the conflict that we see at the moment, and the pandemic risk as well. There's actually a clear need to reform our agricultural programs to deliver on climate action and long-term food security. And the private and the public sector need to work together on this. They need to work in tandem to invest in a more sustainable future for agriculture. We need to enable also a just transition towards a net zero and nature positive and a food secure food system that will be more robust and resilient. It is going to be difficult because agricultural programs can be very challenging to reform, since many operations and farmers rely on government support to stay viable. But last year we released a statement on EU agricultural subsidies, and that proposed a reduction in the direct support for the high emitting commodities such as beef and dairy, and support for the affected farmers to transition to more low carbon production. And that was actually the first time that investors had spoken out on this issue of agricultural subsidies. So, I mean, obviously the UN has pointed out there's over 500 billion in harmful subsidies to agriculture right now, but there's also a huge opportunity to transition to a new way of producing food and generate millions of new jobs that are fit for the future, as well as supporting farmers in this transition. In fact, a study by ILO, which I know that ILO was involved in, looked at the transition to net zero in Latin America and saw there could be a huge increase in millions of new jobs through a transition to net zero, and increases in plant-based food production as well. So I think this all highlights the need for greater investment in sustainable food. We need to diversify production and look at agroecological production, and also plant-based food products and technologies as well that can reduce the pressure on land and on animal feed as well. So I think what we need to see more of is the governments and multilaterals and the private sector all working together to play their part in that transition and aligning better their agricultural subsidies with climate and nature.
Well, thanks, Helena. Obviously, a very complex issue ranging from issues of carbon emissions, the loss of biodiversity, food security, health issues, and also because we talk of agriculture, which we know is the largest global employer. So we will come to solutions as you started to speak about later in the conversation, but please allow me now to turn to Arab. And so Arab, we heard about
Her Excellency is here. Sorry, I sent you a message and she has to leave.
Oh, fantastic. Soon. Welcome, Excellency, first, and then we go to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much. That is very kind. I'm, however, very much looking forward to also hear Arab's intervention. So we'll try to stay for that. Apologies also for being late. I hope the sound and video is working well. Thank you so much for inviting, for giving a kind of open speech, but you have already started this conversation. Stockholm+50, which will take place a few weeks from now, is really about a healthy planet for the prosperity of all. It's about seizing the opportunity and taking the responsibility. And the issue of jobs and just transition is in very many ways at the heart of that discussion. We will also, and I think this also goes in line with today's discussion, it's very much about connecting the people, planet, prosperity. It's also about connecting in the sense of connecting biodiversity, climate, pollution, oceans with the development and well-being. It's about mobilizing governments, civil society, youth, and very much expanding the variety of voices contributing to the transition that we need to do. It's also about accelerating implementation of commitments. And I think all of this we will not be able to do if we don't also include in that discussion the discussions of jobs and a just transition. So with this in mind, let me also just maybe draw your attention to a few, let's say, messages that we're starting to see coming out from consultations, the preparatory meeting in New York. And there's a variety of voices, a variety of messages, but I think we see kind of a common thread in some of those. One is the importance of a strong multilateral system in itself, and a multilateral system that is working very much in the same direction. So indifferent on who you represent in the UN family, we are all working towards the net zero, nature positive, zero pollution. So the nexus conversation. And today's conversation, in a way, is a very important part of that. The other part that we see is, of course, the recognitions of that we come from different circumstances and also therefore have different opportunities towards securing a healthy planet, and that needs to be acknowledged. I was just kind of listening to the last intervention here, and then I made the reflection to another message that's come across quite clearly, and that's the importance of the, let's say, the enabling environments, the investment climates in developing countries, and what can we do to create that and create a level playing field. The alignment on finance flows is another area. Interesting also, which again, I think connects very well to today's discussions, is the focus on human well-being beyond the paradigm of traditional measures and approaches. How do we actually measure well-being, and what does it mean then for the issue of green jobs and just transition? My Minister Strandhäll, spoke in New York at the preparatory meeting of Stockholm of the importance of connecting planet and people, and that investing in the planet is investing in people. And I think here we hear a wide variety of voices bringing the issues of education, of knowledge sharing, of reskilling, technology, digitalization, and green jobs. And also the need of the urgency of transforming and a system-wide transformation of some high impact value chains. So with that in mind, and this is a very short introduction, but I also wanted to share with you just some of the kind of areas that we see starting to shape up for the discussions in the leadership dialogues taking place in Stockholm a few weeks from now. The area that you will be discussing here today, I unfortunately have to leave, but I also have colleagues on the call who will also take this with us. But maybe a question back to the group, if there is time for further discussion, is very much on, how can we connect the discussions of just transition to the healthy planet, and what needs to happen to be able to do so? And in this field, what could be the key messages coming out from Stockholm that could help to advance this agenda at Stockholm and beyond? So with that, I thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and very much looking forward to hear also Arab speaking later, and to hear also a readout from the conversation today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think this was very helpful, and I think you gave us already some insights in terms of issues that are emerging in the consultations so far. And I think all what you have said is going to be very useful even in our conversation today, as we are all trying to connect people, planet, and prosperity. But what you said, very importantly, accelerating implementation and the role of all actors. And I think for us in the work of work, that's also what we are hoping, that governments engage with social partners and the rest of society in this agenda. And the two questions that you put to us, how can this conversation and what's going to take place towards Stockholm +50 connect the just transition and decent work agenda with a healthy planet? And what could we expect from Stockholm that could take forward this agenda? I think we will, with our panel, as we go in the conversation this morning, take up these two questions, and hopefully the results of this discussion and what will come after will also be a useful contribution to the process that you're leading. Again, we know, Excellency, it's a busy moment for you, and really it's a high appreciation of the privilege you've given us to speak to us this morning. And we look forward to keeping working with you and your team towards Stockholm +50, and we'll certainly report back the outcome of this discussion. So with that allows me to perhaps turn to Arab. Arab, I think you can also perhaps bring in your intervention the points that Her Excellency has indicated. But as I was just saying, we heard about pollution and the question of sustainability in food systems. And all of this somehow leads to the need for greater circularity. So what is the problem with the current pattern of resource use and consumption, and what is a circular economy about?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Let me start with your last point on what is circularity about. It seems to be a simple one, a simple definition. The problem is how we implement it. Circularity is about keeping the resources in the system as long as possible by sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling the products and material in an ideally closed loop. So the goal is to reduce waste by keeping products and material within the economy. Think about a city where the products are inside, used as much as possible, or within a firm by reducing waste to the maximum, thinking about it from a metabolism perspective. I stop here the definition. But what does it mean for the food system? I will look at it first from the consumption and production approach, which is for me the bottom line of circular economy or green economy or even sustainability. It defines everything we do, we as individual, but also the firms and the government. When it comes to the food system, we have two important facts that we need to keep in mind. Food loss and food waste, 1/3 is gone. And with the problem of poverty around the world, with the way we are damaging the ecosystem, this is simply non-ethical and unacceptable, and we need to stop it. Are we doing it? No. In piecemeals here and there, generally speaking, we remain a very wasteful society. The problem is, and this is the second fact, that we have the growing middle class in the developing world that are coming. In the next 20-25 years, we expect between 2 and 3 billion additional middle class consumers who will be de facto very wasteful if we don't change the consumption patterns from today, which, as I say, is not happening. Look in Asia, look in Africa, you see the waste when it comes to the middle class, which is incredible. But where it works is at local community level. Local communities de facto are sustainable. They are on circular economy because they care about the ecosystem in which they live. They care about their future. They create jobs. They manage the ecosystem. They are here for the resilience. So what we have to do from a food system perspective is set a level of priorities on how we will go ahead. The first thing is we need to prevent the waste, would it be in the production system or in the consumption system. It's feasible, it's easy, but we are not doing it because we are not behaving responsibly. Once we have the thing that we cannot prevent, we can reuse them for human consumption. When they are no longer good for human consumption, we can use them for animal feed. Otherwise, we can go and recycle them within the system. Would it be for nutrient economy or would it be for energy? And this food waste can be also an excellent resources for that. So ultimately, the disposal at the end, what we will be burning will become a minimum. But if we look throughout the life cycle, we can do a lot with food waste, the waste that we have to waste, I would say, but not just to throw it. There will be other uses there. And we have to look there very clearly about the priorities. One element when it comes to the value chain is to see very carefully in the food supply chain how we can, in each and every step, reduce food waste, which can have a direct and positive impact on jobs and on profitability of the business. What we are not doing very well is how can we audit the business processes and the supply chain get a structured assessment so that we can provide clarity about priorities and how we can move ahead. Once this is being done, the large companies, but also the small and medium enterprises can make a lot of difference. There are a lot of imperfect product, or what we used to call at one point the ugly product that we throw, that are still very good, we can consume them and move. So in the production process, we can do a lot. Technically speaking, we can reduce it. In the packaging process, in the transport, in the conditioning, where we are definitely losing a lot. Many supermarkets and companies have changed, but it is not yet completely scaled up. But the weak point is the consumption behavior. How can you induce people to effectively consume responsibly? You can start by doing it at the level of the schools and the canteen, where you can from there impose certain rules where you only give small plates, so you don't push the people to have too many food. They can repeat as much as they want and so on. There are many campaigns happening around the world. You probably all know about the campaign in Germany about too good to be for the bin campaign, but also in China, where clean your plate campaign in China, which I have contributed. A lot can be done, and this will allow us to really align with SDG 12.3 on having per capita global food waste by 2030. We can reduce by 50% without absolutely any problem, looking at business and employment and local resilience. My last point, and I will come to it in the second part, is in this whole process, you see big companies acting, you see the government taking certain actions, but what is really missing, and what I call the missing middle, is how can we really work and enable the small and medium enterprises at local community, because that's where we can have the food that is produced locally, that is used locally, and that can really build a resilient economy, create the jobs that we need there, that can be for a long time, because they will secure the ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Arap. I think this was a great framing of the issue of circularity. And what you said about 1/3 of food being lost is really just tremendous. So I think this gives us the scale of the challenge. And what you also said about responsible consumption, I think this is a problem we all face individually and collectively. But I think the need for local value chains that you alluded to, it has come very clearly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the breakdown in global supply chains. But I think we come back to that and the role of SMEs in the second part of the conversation. Now it's a pleasure to turn to Marcia. So Marcia, we have a world of oceans, and oceans are the largest part of our planet, in fact. And there are many challenges in that context. So the Just Transition Maritime Task Force has been set up recently with the Global Compact and a number of other partners. Can you tell us what are the main environmental issues the sector is facing, and how are they affecting workers and businesses?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you so much for having me. It's been such a privilege to be on this panel. I'm really happy to tell you more about the work that we're doing at the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, which, as you alluded to, we launched very recently at COP26 with us at the UN Global Compact and the social partners at the International Transport Workers Federation, employers, and of course, parties from the UN system. Now, what's interesting, of course, we've been speaking about a number of sectors and industries, but shipping is a sector and an industry that is very often out of sight, out of mind. And that being the case, despite the fact that it transports 90% of all global trade. So it's a really relevant and important industry, but of course also faces a number of environmental challenges. And here I'll predominantly be focusing on climate change challenges, particularly pertaining to mitigation and adaptation. So when we're talking about shipping and mitigation, we're talking about an industry that really urgently needs to decarbonize. At the moment, it constitutes around 3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So to give a context, that's roughly the same as all emissions from Germany. So to decarbonize, we need to move from what we have as at the moment, which are quite fossil fuel intensive fuels, and we need to move towards new green fuels like ammonia, green hydrogen, and things like this. And then in turn also to new zero emission vessels. So we're not looking at industry that's going to disappear, but we are looking at industry that's going to really fundamentally change. And not only will the shipping industry change in and of itself, but there's a lot of infrastructure that will be needed to facilitate this decarbonisation. So we're talking about an entire change of infrastructure at ports, so making ports ready to actually be able to bunker fuels like ammonia, like green hydrogen, which are very different to the kind of fuels that we're using now. And of course, this is in turn also leading to a whole new energy value chain, right? So we're looking at these new zero emission and zero carbon fuels like ammonia, like hydrogen, that will in turn also require new value chains. And here, for instance, we know that, for instance, green hydrogen will require an increase of renewable energies, which can in turn also, of course, have biodiversity impacts. I've spoken about mitigation, but adaptation is a huge climate risk that we also see in the shipping industry, from things like more volatile weather conditions actually affecting people on board and the ships traveling in the oceans. But of course, ports are really on the front line of climate change, rising sea levels, extreme heat, and we really see this in particular for small island developing states, which really rely on shipping as the kind of lifeline of global trade, that are really sort of affected by climate change. So in terms of how this is affecting workers and businesses, as mentioned, this isn't an industry that will disappear. If anything, actually, trade will increase, shipping will increase, but actually it's just going to really change. And that change will, of course, have impacts on the maritime workforce. So here we're talking concretely about seafarers, so those working on board ships. But of course, it will also affect people working at ports and people also along the broader energy value chain. So what we're really seeing, for instance, is a real need to reskill and upskill the current seafarer workforce. And this will be demanding because we're talking about really moving from one fuel, so a kind of heavy fossil bunker fuel, to fuels like ammonia and green hydrogen, which are more dangerous to use and a bit more complex to handle also. So we're moving from, as I said, one fuel to a kind of multi-fuel training and ensuring that that training and reskilling is done in a way that is also equitable and fair, because what we've seen a little bit, particularly in pertaining to digitization and changes that you see in the shipping industry, is that a lot of the technology is happening in the global north. So how can we make sure that a lot of the skills that will be required to handle these fuels are also shared in an equitable way, which includes updating training systems, certifications in a way that is consistent, and also enabling the global south to transition at the same time. And of course, this has huge safety ramifications as well, because if we don't manage this, and if ships are beginning to handle fuels like ammonia, which are more dangerous, and training hasn't been updated at the pace that decarbonisation is travelling, then of course seafarers will be the ones who face the burden here. And then one final thing, of course, I also wanted to mention, I mentioned ports, climate adaptation. This is obviously really important. This will also involve retraining and upskilling, and particularly of port workers handling these new fuels. But what's also important, and I know we'll come to talk about this in the second part when we talk about opportunities and the route ahead, but when it comes to, as I mentioned, climate adaptation and resilient ports, how can we use the decarbonisation of shipping, which will in turn, of course, also lead to new infrastructure being needed at ports, to also enhance the resilience of ports. So instead of just thinking around decarbonisation and building new infrastructure, how can we think about the co-benefits associated with this new infrastructure to also enhance the resilience of ports and the port communities? In terms of the businesses, and just one final thing, I've talked about workers and how this will affect them, but as kind of alluded to previously, when we talk about the transition in shipping, we really need to make sure that the new technologies, things around zero emission vessels, the new technologies that will be used is also shared in an equitable way with companies and businesses all over the world, and not just have a focused dialogue as it is a little bit in the moment in the global north.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I think this was fantastic. And we all know the importance of shipping and what it means in, what Arab was talking about, this movement of food around the world as well, the global supply chains and international trade. So as you said it rightly, it is not an industry likely to disappear, but one that requires transformation. And that brings a number of issues, and for us in the world of work, the Maritime Conventions have an important role to play here in terms of issues with seafarers and just the impact on the economies and societies. So I think we come back to the solutions that you started to address. But at this point, I'm pleased to bring in the conversation Robert and Bert. So Bert and Robert, we've just heard that several actions and processes can address the current global environmental challenges and their employment impacts. Now, please just bring in the discussion how employees and workers are involved as active agents of change, and what is it that you're also doing to shape the global environmental agenda. So I don't know, Robert, you may want to go first, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, so just very briefly for those of you who aren't familiar yet, IOE, the International Organization of Employers, is one of the constituents of the ILO, and we represent employers globally through our members, about over 150 national employers organizations whose members are individual companies. And they usually have a say in policy making at the national level. And I mean, yeah, first of all, already lots of great remarks here today. I liked the kind of systemic approach. So we've heard, different perspectives from different sectors and issues. So obviously, this whole agenda is very complex, as we're all aware, and employers are obviously involved in different levels. I think, one of the way I see it, at least, I mean, one of the issues, and that was already brought up, is the consumption and production linearity. And, that comes to the crux of the issue, I feel like, because at the one time we're talking about livelihoods and prosperity, and on the other hand, we're talking about protecting the environment and efficient use of resources and decarbonization and so on. And I feel like, there is still this kind of crucial tension between the two, right? Because even though there are some reports of emissions slowing down and GDPs being decoupled from emissions, the main issue is still that in order to create prosperity and improve livelihoods, a lot of it is still based on extraction of resources and on consumption, which is unsustainable. And I feel like one of the main elements that plays into this is prices and the way the economic system is set up currently. So we're already seeing a lot of, positive developments from companies and from governments, and more commitments and plans to decarbonize, new technologies that are helping reduce environmental impacts. But it's still, it's still growing, and it's still at a scale that needs to increase a lot. The main issue is that in a lot of the world, we're still seeking to develop further and to improve livelihoods. But in order to do that, we usually end up increasing consumption and increasing emissions. So, and going to the food example, in the past 100 years, I feel like, one of the main mechanisms of improving livelihoods and increasing access to basic goods and services has been by reducing prices. Usually there's been a kind of drive to make things cheap, with the logic being, if it's cheap, it will be available to more people. But the challenge there is, in order to make something cheap, you usually have to make it in a simple way, and often you have to, cut costs in one way or another, which ends up producing, less sustainable or less optimal solutions when looking at it through the environmental lens. So that's one aspect. So how do we make things higher quality, more environmentally friendly, but also accessible to as many people as possible? And I feel like, some companies grapple with that issue and try to do the best they can, and to go through, whether it be certification or different business processes or innovative business models. But on the other hand, it's not a law, it's not a rule, right? So there will always be the other challenges that the economic system is set up on profits and set up on doing business, right? And this dynamic makes it so that we want to explore all the possible opportunities. So even if there are some companies looking at sustainable ways of production, there will still be other companies who will try and fill in the gaps in the market and will take up the opportunities that might be less sustainable, right? So we can see with oil companies today, I mean, even though we know that we have to reduce fossil fuel use because of the geopolitical situations, the stocks of oil companies, for example, have been going up recently. So that just shows that in the market there are people who want to profit from existing economic activity. If there is an opportunity to profit within the current rules, somebody will do it. So I think there is definitely it's a system level issue, and we have to modify some of these rules and regulations in a way that companies will adapt further and further, and in an accelerated way, because as we all know right now, the speed is becoming the issue. And in the next 10 years, not only do we have to go through all of these transformations, but we have to provide more and more goods and services to more and more people, more and more electricity. So the growth is becoming an issue as well. I don't have an answer, but I think this conversation is a good start to start feeling out some of the solutions. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. I think this is quite interesting, the way you came with a systemic approach. Just this point that businesses want to produce things with a higher quality, with a better environmental performance, but then price-wise, making it accessible to people. So it's a range of challenge, and I think we can come back to what could be done, looking at SMEs as well, because this is even going to be challenging when you look at smaller companies. But let's just, without further ado, turn to Bert. Bert, may I invite you to come in, please?
Thank you very much, Mustafa, and thank you for the opportunity for the organizers to participate in this very interesting panel. I'm happy to come right after Robert because we are social partners. The tripartite approach to these environmental issues is very dear to us. So I'm also very happy, as Robert was indicating, the structural approach that the speakers have been giving here. From the trade union movement, we are, of course, very keen to give the workers and trade union perspective on this debate on jobs. We think that the trade union movement has an important role to play in these environmental challenges. So I'm policy officer at the ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation. We represent 330 trade unions in 160 countries, altogether representing some 200 million workers. This panel is in the context of the Stockholm+50 conference, and Ambassador Lissinger asked us to make an evaluation and to provide points for the conference that takes place in June. And yeah, after 50 years, I was thinking, where are we with our environmental policies? And I don't need to repeat the conclusions from the IPCC. They are very dark, and they continue to get worse every time they present a new report. After 26 COPs organized, emissions are still going up. So we don't see, for the moment, no progress in, for example, climate policy being picked up. Also, in terms of food systems, IPES report with the experts on food systems and industrial livestock production has made very strong conclusions on the environmental impact of our systems. Recently, with the war in Ukraine, a war that has been fueled and has made possible by fossil fuel extraction and is now being used by many countries to even increase fossil fuel exploration and use. So, and it's also being used to diminish the protection of environmental policies in agriculture sector to increase food production. So we are still not very much on a good track in terms of environmental policies. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says that the facts are undeniable. This abdication of leadership is criminal. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our own house. I think that's the context where we are, and apologies to be so bleak, but on the same time, I insist that from the trade union movement, we are big supporters and of multilateralism in environmental policies, and that's why we also are glad to participate in these conferences. And I heard from the previous speakers very interesting possibilities on how to do this. Brendan was referring to the negotiations that are starting up on the plastic treaty. We are very happy with this agreement made in Nairobi a few months ago, and we are very much ready to contribute to this. Important in this sense is the scope that the negotiations will take. We will have to tackle the complete value chain of plastic pollution, right from the extraction of fossil fuels to the end of the waste phase of plastic pollution. And also we are very happy that workers are specifically mentioned in the resolution that will guide the negotiations. So the informal workers, the waste pickers, play an important role, but we would like to insist that workers all around in the value chains, right from the start of the oil exploration to the waste pickers at the end, and the recycling sector and the reuse sector, we have to consider very clearly workers in this process. Another very good example was brought by Marta about the Just Transition Maritime Task Force. We are also very happy that this was agreed in Glasgow, and we very much appreciate this focus on skills and the skills for zero emission ships, the skills to deal with the impact of climate change in the sector that will be very hard touched, because also these are the most seafarers are one of the most vulnerable workers that we have. Health and safety issues are important here that can be tackled in this Just Transition agreement or Just Transition work in the Maritime Task Force. Equality of measures between women and men, the role of young workers are also important aspects there. And finally, I would like to refer to, we have these three environmental crises: climate, biodiversity, pollution, and for us it's combined with a crisis of inequality, and which is largely due to a labor market that's not functioning. And that's why we need just transition policies that focus on social dialogue, investments, decent jobs, and social protection. And we would like to very much to remind the countries, the governments, that they signed the Paris Agreement, and that they, by signing up to the Paris Agreement, they agreed to the imperative of a just transition for the workforce, the creation of decent work and quality jobs. And that's what we think can be a very good and strong driver for global environmental policies, if we have support in civil society from workers, that they are not left behind. We think that this can be like the major push to have these more ambitious policies that we need. Thank you, Mustafa, for this opportunity to share these ideas from the labor movement.
Thank you very much, Bert. And I think you brought back the climate agenda much more strongly, and as the IPCC report has put it out forward, and we have all heard about the UN Secretary General and very powerful words that we have heard, from the UNSG on how the world is lagging behind on the climate agenda, and also the gender dimension that we did not speak about, but which is fundamental in all the issues we've talked about: food security, food systems, circularity, climate, and biodiversity. They all come with an important gender dimension. But I see that there are a few questions coming in the chat, and panelists have been responding. But Sarah, do you want to put forward any question that you have noted so far?
Thank you, Mustafa. And indeed, we received some interesting questions in the chat. So I think one interesting question that was directed to Arab was about how we can reconcile the fact that many of the packaging mechanisms and the materials that are used to prevent food loss, for instance, plastic packaging, come at an environmental cost, which is very high. So how can we address this dilemma? And we had another question, but I think Marta already replied to that question in the chats, which was about what are the challenges actually that ports are facing when it comes to natural disasters. And I think one question, which was also a comment, but I think that could be interesting to address, is a bit whether we actually need like big political changes to make sure that a just transition happens. So that was the 3 questions that I picked out.
Yes, I noted that question from Juan Tucson. I think if I say it correctly, that we need system change, but leadership change. And I think this more or less resonates with what some of the words we've heard. So I just leave it to panel members to comment on that. But maybe Arab, do you want to please start with the first question?
Yes, very well. It's a very good question. The reply is not very easy if we look at the context business as usual. Of course, if we have to bring food from 5,000 or 10,000 kilometers to your plate, it will need to be packaged in a certain way. Now, we have to rethink packaging and rethink plastic. And I used to look at it from an expression that might recall you a movie. I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in the packaging, there are certain elements that are good that we need to maintain, just see how to manage them more efficiently. You have the bad one that we need to get rid of, and the ugly one that we need to transport. So when it comes to the packaging, mainly for the food, we have, first of all, if we consider to have priority local food for local communities, then you need much less packaging, because you are eating fresh food that is locally provided and so on. So this is one of the first elements that would be given priority. The second one is we have to reconsider the type of packaging that we are using, the material, and now you can have material that are different than plastic, and that use much less material that we can that we have to use. The third one is, if we have effectively to use plastic, if it happens to be the best one, then we have to make sure how we can then dispose it in a way that it can be reused and recycled. So it's a very delicate problem, but it can be solved if we start reconsidering from where we are getting our food, how we are effectively processing it and using it, and how within the local communities we can manage this issue of waste from the packaging of the food.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Marcia, I saw you've responded to the question of resilience of port infrastructure, but if you wish to say a few words now, please, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And it's such an important question. And I think, as mentioned a little bit in the chat, our sort of point of departure as such in this work has been mainly to look at decarbonisation and the impacts of getting to net zero and what that will have on the seafaring workforce. But I think sort of taking a step back and just more generally, and a point of discussion also for the panelists, is there is a lot of focus on net zero policies, which is of course incredibly important. And we see this in shipping. There is a lot of focus on how the shipping industry is going to decarbonize, and increased attention on new kind of novel solutions and collaborations to enable this, including this green corridor evolvement, which I posted in the chat, which is all around establishing green shipping lanes, shipping corridors between certain ports, which in turn also includes the bunkering of zero carbon fuels and things like this. But how can we make sure that the debate around net zero policies, like for instance, a green corridor, isn't just around decarbonisation, but is also looking at things like resilience? So when we come to discuss, for instance, a port which would enable a green corridor, which would by then definition have facilities for ammonia, for green hydrogen, how can we make sure that the creation of that green corridor, the creation of that net zero policy, is also thinking about other co-benefits like resilience, like adaptation, building and rebuilding the infrastructure on a port in a way that will stand more dangerous weather situations, rising sea levels, and have a kind of more integrated approach to the design of some of these net zero solutions. And here shipping is a really interesting case study as to how that this could be a possibility here.
Thanks a lot, Martha. So at this point, dear members of the panel, if no one wants to react to the questions, we just turn please to the second part of the conversation, which is now more about solutions. So I would start with Brenda, Elena, Arab, and Martha again to see, from all the environmental challenges we've tried to unpack in the first part of the discussion, and looking at their implications for the world of work. Can you each please mention one way or one policy process through which these challenges can be addressed, but doing so in a way that brings together environmental actions with decent work and a just transition? And I think we can, by doing so, also respond to the question that the ambassador has put forward to us. The solutions that we make, the processes, actions we can identify here, how could they feed into the Stockholm+50 process, and what do we expect back from that process to advance the agenda on decent work and a just transition? So I leave it to you to just please jump in as you wish.
Happy to jump on this question here. I mean, I think it was a really interesting question of, what are the kind of solutions we need to see? I mentioned one in the initial intervention there, which was repurposing agricultural support, because we know that the UN has said there's over 500 billion in harmful agricultural support from governments that has disbenefits for the environment and for people and so forth. So I think that's one really important focus area. We've already had at global level a lot of attention on reforming fossil fuel subsidies, but we have not had so much attention when it regards to agricultural support and spending. So I'd like to put that one on the table as well. But I also think another related one is that we do need a clearer roadmap for where we need to be for a more sustainable food system. And that's something we're going to be calling on with our investor members this year, because investors pointed out that there's already a clear roadmap for energy. We have the IEA net zero roadmap for energy, which very clearly lays out where we need to go and which milestones we need to meet to make a net zero energy system. And that means that the investors and the companies can try to align, or at least measure how they are aligned to that. We don't have an equivalent pathway for agriculture and land use. So we're going to be calling on a clearer pathway that both meets the climate goals. So for low carbon agriculture and also resilience, as well as protection and restoring nature and meeting food security goals. So I think that's a clear way that we can work on a sustainable future and on jobs and job creation as well, if we have a clearer roadmap for where we actually need to be by 2050.
Yeah, absolutely. And I echo what you said, Helena, about repurposing agricultural support. I think obviously this is a matter of trade policy, and the WTO has a clear agenda on addressing inefficient, like those agricultural subsidies that distort international trade and production in agriculture. But why not think of a similar process in the climate context, in the way the Glasgow Pacts talk about phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies? Could we in the future add a reference to phasing out of inefficient agricultural subsidies in the context of the COP as well? Would that make sense in your view?
Absolutely, yeah, because we've already seen a lot of the tension on the fossil fuel side. So there is a precedent there. And also that we know under the UN Paris Agreement, we have Article 21C, which is about the aligning of financial flows. So we've already had a lot of attention on how do we align the financial flows on the energy system, but how do we also do that on the food system as well?
Absolutely. I personally would vote for it. I'm not speaking for the ILO, I speak for myself here. But any other member of the panel wanting to come in just right now?
I can come in if you, if nobody want to jump in. Arab. I'm not referring only to the sector of agriculture or food. I'm referring to the whole economy and all the sectors. In most of the conferences that we have attended in the last 5 years or more, they always end up, we need to have a multi-stakeholder approach and we need to get the business sector involved. Now, we all know that in most of the countries, if not all the countries, the main stakeholders who secure 70, 80% of the GDP, 70, 80% of the workforce, and so on, are the small and medium enterprises. So they are the elephant in the room. Nobody knows how to consider them. And usually, if you speak with government and even the big companies, they will tell you there are too many to be considered efficiently. So there's a misconception there, and then we drop them. But there are facts that SMEs are very innovative. They have local action, they create local jobs, and they create resilience. And there could not be any sustainability. I mean, we have to put it very clearly in our mind. There could be no sustainability delivered without the small and medium enterprises. And if we have been turning around this topic for the last 40 years, it's simply because we have not been able to engage properly with the small and medium enterprises. And this is exactly as difficult as working with the consumption behavior of the people. You can handle the production and difficultly the consumption behavior. So we have elements, would it be seed or other companies, have demonstrated the small and medium enterprises do have the right solution for the local communities where they live and then can be scaled up. But we have not been able to do it. First of all, as I said, the elephant in the room is not considered. We need to give them a voice. We need to make sure that they are heard and considered properly. And this is not just to be decided by government. All the stakeholders have to work on that. And we need to move the small and medium enterprises from the edge where they are now, because we hardly see them, to the center. But the center doesn't mean that we have to bring 100,000 enterprises to the UN or others and have them discuss. You can value the few best, what I call out of them as an example, in order to see how you can move the rest of those enterprises by finding the right mechanism. Now, small and medium enterprises, unlike big companies, need to get access to finance, need to be enabled properly, and need to be properly considered in the procurement system that can give them certain priority. And this, I can tell you, it hardly exists in countries. There have very few countries. The EU is start working on that. So in the procurement process, that can give priority to eco-inclusive, smart, small and medium enterprises who create local jobs, who create jobs for women, who enable youth, should be given priority in the procurement system. This is fundamental if we want to effectively change it. And this is an element that I have been discussing with the Secretary of Stockholm +50. So far, we have been thinking global, and we always say act local. But we know very well, if we have failed on sustainability, it's because we have not been able to act local at the large scale with a transformative impact. Acting local means working with small and medium enterprises and the local communities. This will be fundamental for ecosystem resilience. This is critical for climate mitigation and adaptation. At Glasgow, there were no small and medium enterprises recognized. There were only big companies. How can we do this in Sharm el-Sheikh and Dubai next on in the next meeting is the big question there. And what has been proven also is that small and medium enterprises, as I said, they are very innovative. They contribute to circularity, they contribute to resilience. In our work in SEED, for the 20 years of SEED, we have made a proper assessment on how we can handle that from an entrepreneurship perspective, a non-financial before financial. Non-financial means enabling them properly to allow them to enter the market and understand the policies. Then, of course, access to finance. And we have been speaking with many big banks. They don't know how to deal with small and medium enterprises, but the government is not providing the right policy framework for that. So having the right policies for this is absolutely fundamental, and then opening them something in the strategy to come there. So our wish is to have kind of global coalition on innovation, circularity and entrepreneurship for the small and medium enterprises, by the small and medium enterprises, and to give them the voice, to enable them, and to create the right partnership for that. So for me, a just a transition for all in a healthy planet, because this is the topic that we have there, cannot be achieved seriously without the active involvement of small and medium enterprises. I have been fighting myself for 35 years on sustainable consumption and production, and we missed this elephant in the room. However, their potential,
so I think I
I
will
stop there. I will stop there. Their potential is really untapped as drivers, and we need to make sure that by really considering them, we secure jobs, we protect the ecosystems, and we enhance local resilience. So let us do it. It's too late now, never too late, let us say. We can do things right. Hopefully, Stockholm Plus 50 could be the platform for that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Arab. And I think I know you lead this coalition, but you're in the right platform because you have the International Organization of Employers, you have ITUC, you have the Global Compact. So I think you have at least few people you can take together in caring for this agenda towards Stockholm Plus 50. But I see Brenda. Brenda, over to you, please.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to come back a little bit on the resolution on plastic pollution because it's a huge opportunity ahead. And while it's just one environmental concern, I think Bert touched on this a bit, that across the life cycle of plastic pollution, we see links to all of the topics coming up today. So from resource efficiency, responsible production and consumption, climate, supply chains, trade, maritime issues, food, sector, packaging, equity, so they're all there to some degree. And I wanted to just emphasize the importance of an inclusive process to drive solutions. It's a key opportunity in our journey ahead. And we have an opportunity to get this right from the outset. So a key highlight in the resolution is the emphasis on inclusive processes for all stakeholders. And the informal sector is even featured in the resolution. It recognizes the significant contribution made by workers under informal and cooperative settings to collective sorting and recycling of plastics in many countries. It considers lessons learned, including from informal and cooperative settings. So I think that's a really important framework to set ourselves within. And it's a clear signal from member states on the importance to consider the role and the significant contributions in this process ahead. So we have an opportunity. The major source of the pollution is uncollected and uncontrolled municipal solid waste. In developing countries, the informal solid waste sector is mostly responsible for recovery of resources through door-to-door collection and waste picking activities. But at the same time, it's clear the sector is often under-recognized and can even be criminalized. So this can result in exclusion in the decision-making process of new regulations and frameworks, which we're all familiar with. But I just would hope we can maybe flip around with the considerations and be inspired, perhaps, by the reference I made earlier on small-scale gold mining, how it ended up making a big impact. And we really invite you to be part of the process. We think it's an important community to be involved. For an inclusive transition, it's important to highlight the value the waste sector brings in terms of waste management and resource recovery to society. As I mentioned earlier, the waste pickers are estimated back in 2016, it's an old number, but to about 65% of the plastics for recycling globally. And in order to ensure a just transition and a win for multilateralism, we really must work together. We need the informal sector to be influencers in the plastics process. We need you to deliver your voice from the front line. They are a key part of the solution to pave the way. And we need this to move towards a pollution-free planet. So it is really an opportunity to generate the solutions that are not only good for the planet, but also good for local communities through boosting the economy, creating jobs, improving health and livelihoods, basically to promote equity. So in terms of the ambassador's request at the beginning, Stockholm+50 is an important milestone along the journey to get a legal instrument on plastic pollution by end of 2024. We can be inspired by this event, learn from successes in the past. We'll be hearing a lot about it, link to existing efforts so that we can cooperate and coordinate. That's also a key piece of the resolution. And use it as inspiration to launch the process and build an instrument with impact. So I just wanted to close on inviting you to be part of this inclusive process as we move forward. And thanks for engaging us today.
Thanks very much, Brenda. I think the fact that there is an intergovernmental process to address plastic is already an important step in the right direction, and the way you frame it, getting everybody on board, those in the informal economy, the world of work. So we very much look forward to formally engaging in that process. So and I just turn to the rest of the panel members, if you want to jump in right now. So
yeah, I'll just maybe add,
and then Robert and Bert, please.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll just maybe add a couple more comments, and mainly just building on the fantastic interventions already by Brenda and Arab, because of course, kind of underlying all this is we need, as Brenda mentions, inclusive processes that can also scale, and inclusive processes of collaboration between the various stakeholders that are affected by the various challenges at stake. And this is, of course, where, for instance, examples and case studies like the Just Transition Maritime Task Force that we launched at COP26, which is the first global sectoral task force to tackle an industry and really unpack what a just transition might look like for that industry, with the relevant social partners on board, with the employers, with the relevant partners from the UN system, including ILO and IMO. And then how we're setting this up is we have what's called a global industry peer learning group. And the idea is, of course, it's a global industry peer learning group in the sense we're not yet getting down to the kind of local, national issues, but it's a global group that's bringing together seafarer unions from across the world, including the Philippines and India, a number of employers, a number of other knowledge partners, to already begin unpacking some of the challenges and opportunities in a safe space as such. And some of the inputs from that will, of course, then go into feeding into the important maritime conventions, such as you already mentioned, Kamal, the Maritime Labour Convention. We also have the IMO SCTW Convention. So using this group, this group of complex stakeholders with sometimes different ideas, different challenges, and then also feed into processes that will then in turn also impact that transition to net zero. And of course, I also wanted to mention, particularly on Arab's point, around how can we scale this, and how can we ensure that there are also blueprints for SMEs. And stepping back from the maritime sector for a moment, just to voice some of the other work we're doing at UN Global Compact, where we have around 15,000 companies, including a number of SMEs, and that are part of our initiative. And here we've actually also launched a Just Transition Think Lab, which will have a number of companies in it from across sectors and geographies. And the idea is that this Think Lab will also demystify a little bit what exactly we mean by just transition, because I think we can all agree, this is a relatively, in some sense, high-level discussion that we're having. But of course, a number of companies and businesses, they want to get practical. What does it actually mean for me and my business? How do I actually implement a just transition? So what we'll do in this Think Lab is demystify this based on, of course, international guidelines like those put forward by the ILO. And then we have academy sessions, we have accelerator programs, which aim to then translate the work being done to our broad audience, including SMEs, including these 15,000 companies, as kind of ways to scale up and scale up some of the impact that we're talking about here. And so I just wanted to underline that, but really important points being made.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Bert, Robert, do you want to come in, please?
Bert, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just want to pick up a few of the points that are made and in fact reiterate them and frame them in our trade union social justice context. The importance of an inclusive process is of course crucial, and for us we translate it on different levels as the importance of social dialogue. Social dialogue with the social partners, as has been explained just 2 minutes ago by Marta in the maritime sector, is the central part for us, for the workers' movement, if we speak about just transition. When there is no just transition, for us, there is no just transition. That's a simple message that we would like to stress. For example, in a country like Chile, that had in their national climate plans, their NDCs, a whole chapter on just transition, but never spoke with the trade unions, for us, that's not credible just transition. We are happy that with the new government in Chile, I saw a few days ago, that they started again tripartite negotiations with all the social partners on climate policies and broader labor market policies, and that's where we would like to go. Also, I think we have partners and organizations that can support this process in all the different sectors, not only in the maritime sector. The International Union of Food Workers and Agriculture Workers, IUF, has, for example, recently presented a guide on that they call Fighting for Our Future, on tackling the climate crisis and environment crisis in the intensive livestock production. And that's a really good example in this complicated sector, agriculture, with a lot of informal workers, informality, where workers' organizations can together make progress on these issues. Other good examples that we see are, of course, Spain, that has institutionalized just transition in a very comprehensive way and is doing agreements at sector levels and in regions. Scotland, where we see the transition from fossil fuel offshore production to offshore energy wind, and where the unions are very much engaged in seeing that these jobs in these new renewable sectors are effectively decent jobs, quality jobs. And also in the global south, we see many of our partners engaging very constructively in Bangladesh, a very complicated country in terms of labor rights, where labor rights are not being respected. We see even in these complicated situations, trade unions engaging on the importance of climate change and stressing social protection. If you can imagine, 4.1 billion people in the world have no access to social protection. What does this mean if you see the impact of climate change, if you see the impact of biodiversity loss, if agriculture protection falls down to droughts or storms? So for us, it's just transition is about a seat at the table for the workers, and then make it concrete with skills, social protection measures, investments. And that's, I think, there's many good examples on the table, and I think that's the hope that we have to bring into the Stockholm+50 negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bert. Robert, over to you, please.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, unfortunately, not enough time to go into all of the different elements and points. It's been a great discussion, but basically, yeah, I mean, there are lots of challenges, but as we've seen, there's also solutions, and there is a positive way forward. And I'd like to echo most of the points that were made so far. I think they're all quite relevant, and particularly Arabs, about the SMEs and the importance of SMEs and including them. And I liked the mention about the procurement elements, because I also feel like SMEs are part of the system as well, right? And sometimes they just if you own a small local shop and you're dependent on offer and demand, and if the products you're ordering are packaged in plastic, it's harder for you to find products that aren't packaged in plastic. So I feel like there's again this systemic issue where we have to work along the chain and provide more access and better options to a lot of companies and a lot of people. Similar, for example, in the EU, you know, if you decide that we won't have internal combustion vehicles anymore, the whole industry will change. Perhaps there will be less jobs in the electric vehicle supply chain. The SMEs, you know, producing specific parts for the internal combustion engine, they don't necessarily know how to produce batteries straight away. So then the skills component comes in. And for the IOE, yeah, definitely the skills agenda is a priority, the informal sector is a priority, and SMEs. Those three are key to having a real global systemic just transition and more sustainable economic system, right? And then another challenge also is the jobs, the decent work and the good jobs. Sometimes the good jobs are not environmentally friendly, right? So, you know, if you have the coal sector and the oil industry, for example, high risk, high skilled jobs, sometimes they pay more than a solar panel installer job. So again, there's different incentives and subsidies to work with and government regulations that can improve these situations. But I feel like, yeah, you know, solutions are possible. And in my mind, what some of these high level events can bring more to the fore is some of these solutions that have the potential to be the most disruptive and to be the most scalable, you know. And I feel like the two examples I would like to give before wrapping up is in the mid 20th century, in my mind, the most disruptive and the most kind of inspiring examples have been these huge public works projects, right? Like the Manhattan Project or the race to the moon. They weren't profit driven, they were idea driven. It was a mission, and you know, whole countries decided it was a priority and worked towards that with a single goal. I feel like we need maybe a bit more of that. And, you know, in today's politics, as we've seen, climate change is there, but it's still not the goal and the objective. The economic and political priorities still take precedence often. And then the other example I wanted to bring is, yeah, disruptive technologies, you know, companies like Uber, for example, they've disrupted the global taxi industry. And I think they're still not profitable, probably. They're still getting a lot of, you know, investment capital in, because there's a belief that this model works and that this model can be scaled and can be good. So I think, you know, we have to look at how to drive financial flows and how to improve access across the board, and especially in developing countries, to some of these models that can really be disruptive. And an example in the food industry is there are already companies producing artificial whey protein. So instead of having a cow to produce milk and then to make dairy products, we're actually already able to, at cost, so same cost as normal milk, we can produce artificial whey protein with yeast and make ice cream, milk, cheese, etc. And this kind of production can completely disrupt the system, because all of a sudden you don't need the land for the animals. You can do it locally. You can do it in every supermarket. You can do it in every city. The cost is the same. The efficiency is 90% higher, because no emissions, no food needed, etc. So I think, you know, some of these solutions really have the potential, but we have to push them more, and we have to identify them more and implement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think disruptive technology and change is fundamental. So, Excellencies, dear panel members and colleagues and friends, so I think this has been a very rich conversation. I am aware we just come to the end of our time, but just I wanted to recap with 2 points. And I think one message we have heard from the ambassador also, and I think you all echo it, is that multilateralism is the right way to address global solutions, global problems, and find global solutions. But we must recognize that multilateralism has to be more inclusive. You know, it has to be in the world of work we consider to be based on social dialogue and inclusive participation and tripartism. And I think what we would like to see also, including on the plastic agenda, is an important role for the informal economy and those active in plastic. And the second point is about systemic change. And I think it's in many areas what you've spoken about is about systemic change. And in my view, it's what Helena said about repurposing agricultural support. And I think this doesn't need to be limited to agriculture. It can be done in many other ways, repurposing, and doing so can also help with public procurement to benefit sustainability and job creation. There is a need about realigning finance. I think there's an effort on investment and realignment of finance, but this is needs to be an important aspect of the systemic change. And what Arab said about, still thinking global, but acting local, but doing that in much more powerful ways and at scale, engaging with small and medium-sized enterprises. And I think Arab, for me, acting locally can also bring the agenda on the social and solidarity economy, which is going to be quite important in this agenda. I think for business, Robert, you've spoken about producing better in a more environmentally friendly ways, but at affordable cost. And I think this is going to be a systemic issue for business. Obviously, technology, we live in a digital age, and this will have an important role in disrupting the system, but taking it in a right direction. And I think with all of this, we have elements to connect the decent work agenda with just transition and a healthy planet. But in doing so, as some colleagues have mentioned in the chat, not to forget the agenda on inequality, poverty reduction, and with the current crisis we're living, the risk of hunger and malnutrition. But we have rooms for hope, because we've heard about this initiative on the seed and engaging with SMEs. We've heard about the Maritime Task Force, the Just Transition Think Lab, and we have the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for a Just Transition, which is taking a powerful start at the ILO. So with all of this, I think we have elements to go and contribute to a successful Stockholm+50 conference. So I just want to end by thanking you really very much, dear colleagues, for spending the time with us this morning, distinguished panel members, and all those who participated, Excellency and the government of Sweden for co-sponsoring the event, and Geneva Environment Network for hosting it, and my colleagues Sarah, Gondi, and Howie for helping put it together. So Jana, with that, I thank you again personally, and turn over to you for the end. Again, thank you so much for a very rich exchange.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, and indeed also big thanks to you for your efficiently moderation and chair of this event. Thank you to all the persons who have been, to the attendees who have been with us until now, to those who will be watching this video later, to all the little hands that have been helping in setting up this event. And what we have heard today is that indeed the discussion is going to continue, not only at Stockholm+50, but also in the margins of the upcoming International Labour Conference. We are happy to come with some of these topics related to the environment and support whatever you are doing, Kamal, and all the other panelists that we have here heard here today. And also you have mentioned in the plastic process and this international intergovernmental committee that will be negotiating and move on these topics. So with that, I think it's time to close this event, to wish everybody a happy Mother Earth Day. We have heard today that multilateralism has to be more inclusive, and indeed, let's it be more inclusive in all our forums. And with that, maybe also bring to your attention two events that are upcoming next week. We will be discussing SAND with bringing 10 strategic recommendations to avert a crisis in this area. And we will also be back with the chemicals and waste briefing, discussing how chemicals and waste negotiations are moving forward. We hope to see you at these events or in other occasions. Many thanks to all of you.